Okay, this is our first podcast for Bio 1, and in this podcast, we'll be covering the introduction to the study of life. And this is an introductory chapter to this first unit, which will also be covering in this unit the chemistry of life. We'll look at the major molecules that make up living organisms. We'll look at the molecule, the water molecule, and the importance of it to life. We'll also be looking at the carbon molecule and the importance of it to living things. And we'll also look at the other major molecules that make up living organisms or that are important for living organisms. And then we'll end this unit by also looking at the cell, the structures of the cell, and the major organelles and workings of the cell. So that's the topics for this first unit. So we begin again with the introduction to the study of life. Now, in this, we're just kind of introducing what the field of biology is, and biology is basically just the study of life. So um, biologists ask questions like, how does a single cell develop into an organism? How does the mind work? How living things interact with communities? So biology is a very broad field, and so we have two courses to cover the introduction to a lot of those different fields. Um, so we begin by just kind of introducing um, this area of study of living things, and we can start by saying that life is not simple. So it defies a simple definition. We'll be looking at the major characteristics of life in a minute, um, but life is not easily defined, and all of the things that make living um, organisms stay alive is not easily defined. The field of study in biology can range from the small areas of living things all the way to very large scope of living things. So if you're following along in your outline, and I recommend doing that, there's an outline that goes along with the lectures here. In that outline, we look at these different levels of biological organization. And in these, we can say that basically life can be studied at different levels, all the way from the small to the large. So here's an example here that shows looking at plants and trees here. So a biologist can study these trees at an organism level. That would be right here, the tree. Or we could go down to the smaller levels of that tree, like the structures of the tree, the leaves, stems, or leaves. Or we could look at the tissues. That would be a smaller level. The tissues are made up of cells. The cells are made up of organelles, which we'll learn about. And then the organelles themselves are made up of atoms. Well, they're made up of molecules, which are made up of atoms. So biology can look at any one of these different levels of areas, all the way from atoms up to individual organisms or groups of organisms called populations, or different populations living together called communities. And communities plus the non-living surroundings is called an ecosystem. And the Earth is referred to as the biosphere. That's all the ecosystems of the Earth. So those are different levels of biological study, of studying life. We can study life at these different levels. The next thing we can talk about in the study of life is what is required for all life is energy. And so we have an energy flow or energy utilization that occurs for life here on Earth. And all this energy ultimately comes from the sun. Sunlight reaches the earth, and that is picked up by producers, photosynthetic organisms that are able to convert that energy into a molecular form, and then that molecular form of energy can then be utilized by consumers. And so this cycling of energy and the chemical nutrients that go with it is essential for living things. So energy is essential. Another thing we could mention here is a concept or a theme that runs through biology that is referred to as the relationship of structure to function. And we can see this at all of those different levels of organization that we mentioned, from the molecule to the cell to the structures to the organs to the organ systems, that there are certain structures that living organisms are made up of, and these structures relate to their function. So we can see that in a few examples right here. The bone here of this bird's wing is hollow and aerodynamic, and that design or that structure relates to the function of flight for the bird. If it was not aerodynamic and hollow like this, the bird would not have that ability of function. We can see this at the organelle level within the cell. We see structures like this mitochondria, where cell respiration takes place, and that takes place on these little folds that are in this organelle. And these folds right here are essential for a lot of the molecular reactions that take place, the chemical reactions that take place in cellular respiration have to take place on this membrane, which is in that fold there. And then we can see that in the neuron, the neural cells of the nervous system. They have these extensions that come off of the cell that relay these signals from cell to cell, and that is the design of that structure relates directly to the function of that structure. So we see that correlation between structure and function. That's a theme that we see throughout biology. Okay, the next thing we want to mention is about the cells. All living things are made up of cells, so that's one of our levels of organization. The cell is a very important level. The cell is considered the basic unit of life. All living things are made up of cells, and some living things are only one cell, and those are referred to as single-celled organisms. And there's two main types of cells that exist in living things. We have what's referred to as our prokaryotic cells, and that would be like our bacterial cell. And these are very simple cells. They don't have a lot of the complex organelles that we see in more complex organisms like ourselves. And then we have our eukaryotic cell, which is like our cells, and they're going to have many more organelles. The genetic information is housed within a large structure called the nucleus. Those are the two main types of cells that make up living organisms. We have a prokaryotic cell, which we find in bacteria, and then we have our eukaryotic cells, which we see in all other complex organisms, fungi, plants, animals. Okay, another common theme within biology is genetics. So all living things are based on this genetic code that we know a lot about now. And so we have this hereditable information that is passed from organism to organism in our DNA, deoxyribonucleic acid. We'll study a lot about this in future chapters, but here we'll introduce it by stating that it is the substance, the molecule that genes are found on, and it is transmitted from parent to offspring. So we have a combining of those genes that come from the father and the sperm and the egg and the mother. Those genetics are combined to form a fertilized egg, and they have a combination of genes in that offspring. Okay, now this genetic information that's found in this nucleus is in a structure, in a molecule called DNA. And DNA is actually made up of two long chains of units, subunits called nucleotides. And a nucleotide is made up of a base, a sugar, and a phosphate. And so what differs in these nucleotides is the base. There's 4 different types of bases, and this basically makes up our code, are these 4 different types of bases that are found on the nucleotides. So a different sequence of these bases, these A, T, C's, and G's are the letters representing those bases, would code for different types of structures. Blades of grass would have certain code, and frogs for the structures that we see in frogs, they have certain codes, and we have certain codes for different traits that we have. So this is the blueprint of the physical structure that that organism has. And so this is the basis for heredity, is this genetic information found on this molecule. Okay, the next thing we want to mention is some characteristics of life. So we've mentioned that that's a major theme, that these different things are major themes, the relationship of structure to function, and then this heredity. But when we want to define life, we have some different things that we can say are characteristics that we would see in every living thing. We would see these certain characteristics. So in your outline, this is under characteristics of living things, and we start in your outline. The first one we list there is order. So all living things have order, this symmetry that we see, like in the sunflower right here. It's not just a random mixing of characteristics that make up living things. They're very organized, and so order is a common characteristic of living things. The next one is regulation. So all living things have to regulate internal different parameters within inside the body, and so regulation. The next is growth and growth and development. We all living things grow and develop. Energy processing is metabolism. Everything has to utilize some of that energy that we talked about earlier. Respond to the environment. Everything from plants to animals to fungi have to respond to the environment, whether it's just dropping leaves in the winter for deciduous trees or whatever. That's a response to the environment. There's various types. DNA, we talked about reproduction and then being able to pass on that genetic information to offspring. That's a common characteristic of all living things. And then also adaptation. All living things adapt to the environment, meaning that if you have a trait that helps you to survive, you will survive. If you have a trait that makes you susceptible to the harsh environment, then you may likely die and your traits die with you. So that's called natural selection, and we see that occurring. So that is something that we see in all living things as well. And so those are the major characteristics that we see in living things. Okay, so our first podcast ends here, and we will pick up. We're still in this introductory chapter on the study of life, and so we'll pick up here to continue this in the next podcast.